We tend to do a lot of mispredictions, and things change all the time. Reference points, mindsets, comparisons. And I'll give you some examples. Main point is that we mispredict our emotions and we misremember our experiences. And if we know about some of this, perhaps we can shift our own mindset. We can set our own reference points. We can decide who we want to compare against, and then maybe we can fight some of the disadvantages, and then reduce pain and increase happiness, well-being, and flourishing, right? So there's one effect that's called hedonic adaptation. I took this from Roy, did these wonderful slides, so I don't have any responsibility for that. But hedonic adaptation in the judgment and decision-making behavioral economics literature refers to a change in income or experiences that temporarily affects happiness, but we very quickly adapt to things. So when I ask you, what will happen if you separate from your partner? What will happen if you go into an accident? You lose a loved one, or all sorts of things. People predict horrible outcomes for themselves. You know, I'll never recover from this. It will never be the same. Actually, we have a lot of evidence that tracks all these kinds of things over time. And even here, for example, our world in data does this comparison between women and men. I don't know how much you can see all that far away, so I will read this out loud to you. So we have over here unemployment, marriage, divorce, widowhood, birth of a child, and layoffs. Even if you can't see very much, what you can see is that these things are pretty stable. There are some peaks that happen around the event. So for example, a marriage, sometime before the marriage, happiness goes up. And then some of the peak, especially for women, seems like the peak is on the marriage, but then give it 2 years and then you're back to the same level of happiness. Which I have to say is not too bad. Of course, you want to compare this to people who never get married in order to see, which I'll show you in another slide or two. But generally what this says is that people think it's like, if I will have marriage in my life, then my life will be transformed. I found my significant other, my life partner, then it will just be an ongoing journey towards the peak of happiness. But it does contribute for 2-3 years, and then it goes back down to the average because we adapt. We have hedonic adaptation. Also for negative things, divorce is interesting because a few years before the divorce, especially for men, women is a little bit more tricky, more stable, but men really it goes down, goes down, goes down. And then in the divorce starts to go up, and then it goes around the same kind of level of happiness that happened prior to the marriage that has been dissolved. I think the most interesting is widowhood, losing your significant other, losing somebody that is very important to you in your life. It seems devastating because the drop in happiness cannot be ignored. It's like one of the biggest peaks over here, both for women and for men. It really dropped. But then within 2-3 years, people find their life. They come together. Not all of them. This is on average. Some people do better, some people do worse. But as an aggregate, we get back to the same level. So you can think, what does this mean to you? I find this to be kind of optimistic. Because it does mean that whatever it is that happens to us, even if there's a pandemic, a year or two ago, we thought the pandemic, this I thought, going to change our lives forever. We're never going to recover from this. All sorts of people have been affected. Now, still some things happening in Hong Kong, but we almost, if you go to, say, I grew up in Israel, if you go to Israel, the US, Europe, people almost forgot about this. But we did go through some trauma. We lost people. We went through some processes. But we adapt to this. And even if pandemic would not be resolved, and there's all sorts of changes around us, climate change and politics and all that, then we find the way to bounce back. Very similar graph. You see marriage, separation, divorce seems to be very interesting. So I was able to triangulate both world data, so we're talking about millions of people, with this paper So different authors, different years, different journal, but the trends are very, very similar. So interesting that even with unemployment, even with disability, people find a way to bounce back finally at the end. So it all started, Daniel Kahneman and Kruger did this kind of things. Actually, when Daniel Kahneman received the Nobel Prize, they asked him, do you have something else that you didn't do with Amos Tversky, something that is not judgment decision making? And in his speech, he talked about his happiness studies. So Daniel Kahneman is not well known in the world for happiness studies, but a lot of his last 2 decades is dedicated to pain and happiness. So this is from their paper, 2006. Very similar trend, 15, 20 years ago. Very similar trend to some of the more recent papers that I just showed you from 2021, 2020, 2008. This one I can't remember which year, 2018. Yeah. So back in 2006, there were some of the first ones to show married females go up and then it bounces back to the same kind of happiness. And overall, life satisfaction, when we ask people how satisfied are you in your life, people are generally, and cross-cultural, it doesn't really matter where, you can go to developing countries, people generally report higher level of satisfaction. At the end of this session, I'll talk a little bit about cross-cultural differences. Yeah, so more about this, death of a spouse, adaptation to being fired, goes down a little bit, not too much, like by half a point, and then bounces slowly back up. And then even when we ask people, what do you think would happen if you went into an accident and you lost the ability to walk, or you lost an arm, or you lost the ability to see, or your ability to process all sorts of things? It seems like people think that this would be catastrophic, but already from the 1980s, we have some evidence that generally when we ask people who have disabilities compared to the general population, we find very similar trends. It's not that there are no differences. There are some differences, especially about the highest well-being, which some of the disabled people with disabilities don't get to. But even with something like a spinal cord injury, you can see that most of the people are actually, it's a very normal distribution, very similar to all of us. So regardless of what our situation is, regardless of what we think is happening around us and how catastrophic things are, we do find a way, at least with happiness, to adjust when we feel like we have well-being. I'm gonna skip this one. I'm gonna get to this one. Another one of these seminal papers that Daniel Kahneman did. And Daniel Kahneman talks about 2 different patients. Patient A over here is undergoing surgery, and the pain the patient A experiences is like 2 very high peaks. And then at around 10 minutes, it drops altogether. And then patient B has like a small peak, and then a higher peak, and then the highest peak, and then another peak, and then another smaller peak, and then finally another even smaller peak. And then he tries to contemplate, and he was very curious about this, who of these 2 patients experiences stronger pain, more lasting pain. So when we ask patients, when we go to patient A and patient B, and we ask them how unsettling the experience was, how much pain did you experience, what would they answer? So what's your take on this? What would you expect here? Patient A or patient B? Who experienced more pain? Who would say that they experienced more pain? Yeah, let's contemplate the trickiness about this together. Yeah, so there's longer duration and there's just accumulation of more pain altogether in patient B. However, knowing what you know, right, yeah. So that's a very good take on the previous point that I made. So you made that connection and it becomes a lot easier to understand this. But we're going to see Daniel Kahneman talk about this. And the question is, what would, so overcoming resilience, you made that connection between those 2. But what is really the difference between patient A and patient B? What is the number one cause that would lead patient A to report having suffered more pain? What kind of factors? How can we, what is the key word here? that would lead patient A to feel like they've experienced more pain. The increase is smoother, okay? Okay, great. So you identified one difference between those two, and this is the adaptation. So this was more gradual than this one. Great. What other things can we look at here that we will say might affect people's perceptions and would lead to A, experiencing more pain? Very good. We identified the two big factors. And it also has to do with the highest, the peak of where it ended. So here the end gradually also decreased to the point that the last thing that happened is much lower pain. Here the last thing that happened is much higher pain. And it seems like when we recall, when we look back at the things that were painful for us, we don't normally remember how long that was. We don't remember the ups and the downs so much. We tend to remember the last thing that happened to us, the conclusion of the whole thing, perhaps the relief from this whole experience. So we can hear a little bit about that from Daniel Kahneman.
Everybody talks about happiness these days. I had somebody count the number of books with happiness in the title published in the last 5 years, and they gave up after about 40, and there were many more. There is a huge wave of interest in happiness among researchers. There is a lot of happiness coaching. Everybody would like to make people happier. But in spite of all this flood of work, there are several cognitive traps that sort of make it almost impossible to think straight about happiness. And my talk today will be mostly about these cognitive traps. This applies to lay people thinking about their own happiness, and it applies to scholars thinking about happiness, because it turns out we're just as messed up as anybody else is. The first of these traps is a reluctance to admit complexity. It turns out that the word happiness is just not a useful word anymore because we apply it to too many different things. I think there is one particular meaning to which we might restrict it, but by and large, this is something that we'll have to give up, and we'll have to adopt a more complicated view of what well-being is. The second trap is a confusion between experience and memory. Basically, it's between being happy in your life and being happy about your life, or happy with your life. And those are two very different concepts, and they're both lumped in the notion of happiness. And the third is, it's the focusing illusion. And it's the unfortunate fact that we can't think about any circumstance that affects well-being without distorting its importance. I mean, this is a real cognitive trap. There's just no way of getting it right. Now, I'd like to start with an example of somebody who had a question and answer session after one of my lectures reported a story, and that was the story. He said he had been listening to a symphony, and it was absolutely glorious music. And at the very end of the recording, there was a dreadful screeching sound. And then he added, really quite emotionally, it ruined the whole experience. But it hadn't. What it had ruined was the memory of the experience. He had had the experience. He had had 20 minutes of glorious music. They counted for nothing because he was left with a memory. The memory was ruined, and the memory was all that he had gotten to keep. What this is telling us, really, is that we might be thinking of ourselves and of other people in terms of two selves. There is an experiencing self who lives in the present and knows the present. It's capable of reliving the past, but basically it has only the present. It's the experiencing self that the doctor approaches, you know, when the doctor asks, does it hurt now when I touch you here? And then there is a remembering self. And the remembering self is the one that keeps score and maintains the story of our life, and it's the one that the doctor approaches in asking the question, how have you been feeling lately? Or how was your trip to Albania? Or something like that. Those are two very different entities, the experiencing self and the remembering self. And getting confused between them is part of the mess about the notion of happiness. Now, the remembering self is a storyteller. And that really starts with a basic response of our memory. It starts immediately. We don't only tell stories when we set out to tell stories. Our memory tells us stories. That is, what we get to keep from our experiences is a story. And let me begin with one example. This is an old study. Those are actual patients undergoing a painful procedure. I won't go into detail. It's no longer painful these days, but it was painful when this study was run in the 1990s. They're asked to report on their pain every 60 seconds. And here are two patients. Those are their recordings. And you are asked, who of them suffered more? And it's a very easy question. I mean, clearly patient B suffered more. His colonoscopy was longer, and every minute of pain that patient A had, patient B had, and more. But now there is another question. How much did these patients think they suffered? And here is a surprise. And the surprise is that patient A had a much worse memory of the colonoscopy than patient B. The stories of the colonoscopies were different, and because a very critical part of a story is how it ends. And neither of these stories is very inspiring or great, but one of them is distinctly worse than the other. And the one that is worse is the one where pain was at its peak at the very end. It's a bad story. How do we know that? Because we asked these people after their colonoscopy, and much later too, how bad was the whole thing in total? And it was much worse for A than for B in memory. Now, this is a direct conflict between the experiencing self and the remembering self. From the point of view of the experiencing self, clearly B had a worse time. Now, what you could do with patient A, and we actually ran clinical experiments, and it has been done and it does work, you could actually extend the colonoscopy of patient A by just keeping the tube in without jiggling it too much. That will cause the patient to suffer, but just a little, and much less than before. And if you do that for a couple of minutes, you have made the experiencing self of patient A worse off, and you have made the remembering self of patient A a lot better off. Because now you have endowed patient A with a better story.
So this is quite remarkable. The idea that we will inflict more pain, increasing the duration slowly, just so the remembering self will have a better story to tell the self, that they experience a lesser pain. So this has been controversial. Should we implement this kind of thing? Should we keep in the colonoscopy to increase pain, although we don't have to inflict this pain, just so the remembering self will have a better story to tell? It's an ethical, moral dilemma, but I think it's a fascinating thing to see about the human mind and how judgment decision-making really comes into play about something like pain, about something like happiness, and the kind of stories that we build about things like surgery in our life. So this is the actual paper, 1996. It is in a journal called Pain. And you can see over here exactly what Daniel Kahneman wrote about the intensity of the pain recorded over the last 3 minutes of the procedure. So it seems like the last 3 minutes of the procedure really affect things. Now, you might think, does this matter? So like, what do we do with this? Do we really implement this now in medical procedures? And I think what's fascinating to see is that how some of the most prominent people in judgment decision-making actually started to do their research because they had so much at stake given how we treat pain. And I think there's no more remarkable story, at least in the judgment decision behavioral economics literature, than Dan Ariely. So I think you've seen Dan Ariely has been burned in his body. About 70% of his body has been burned. And the reason why he decided to go into judgment decision-making and psychology is because a lot of psychology research is me research. We want to study ourselves. We want to understand ourselves. We also want to help ourselves. So there's this joke I did like a psychology undergraduate many years ago is that we are the most messed up people because we all want to solve our issues. So you have a large group of psychology students who are really messed up and trying to resolve all kinds of things. So it really depends. Different people have different things that bring them to psychology, but at least with Dana Ariely, it seems like a very clear story that he's very happy to share. So I'll play this to you, and I want you to think about what are the implications of what Daniel Kahneman just told us about experiencing self versus the remembering self. So more pain for the remembering self if the intensity is high at the end, compared to the experiencing self that's larger duration, but at the end the intensity is lower.
Many years ago, I had the misfortune of being involved in an explosion. And as a consequence, I got burned in about 70% of my body. And I spent the next almost 3 years in hospital. Having no skin creates opportunities for incredible pain. And then they start taking bandages off. That was kind of a daily torture. And I would try to convince them all along that the best thing to do was not to pull strongly on the bandages and make them very fast, but to do it slower. So if you imagine that you have like a time horizon, and the question, over this time horizon, what would you want? Do you want high intensity of pain, but for a short duration? Or would you rather have a longer duration, but lower intensity? Right? Do you want to pull the bandage slower, or do you want to rip them off fast, one after the other? And I felt that the better approach would be to have lower intensity and longer treatment. And they felt that I was wrong, that the right way to do is to hold the bandages and rip it off, and hold the next one and rip it off. And of course, they won. I mean, there was no, I was trying to convince them, but there was no way to discuss it with them. So the question basically is, if you think about the painful experience that you have to give a patient, the question is, can you manage it differently so that it creates less pain? And when I got out of the hospital, I started doing research on exactly this question. So I would bring people to the lab, and I would hurt them in different profiles. So I would give them pain that went from low to high, or from high to low. I would give them longer durations of pain at lower intensity, shorter pains at higher intensity, and so on. And after giving people these painful experiences, I would ask them, how painful was this on a scale from 0 to 100? Or I would give them 2 of those and say, which one would you rather experience next? Which one is less painful? It turned out that my intuition was correct as a patient, that it was better to have a lower intensity and longer treatment because we don't incorporate the duration as well into our estimations. If you take something and make it from 40 minutes to 80 minutes, it doesn't become twice as painful. But if you take something from one intensity to another intensity, you can easily make it twice. It's more painful in our memory. The nurses were really kind, amazing individuals. They really dedicated their life to the burn patients. I love them, and I think some of them loved me. At the same time, they were wrong, and they were inflicting too much pain on me, not because they were evil, but because they were just wrong. And the question is, how can somebody who works in a burn department for 15 years, doing this thing day in and day out, really not wanting to hurt their patient, how could they be wrong? How could it be that their understanding of the patient is not accurate? This realization of how the nurses were wrong made me want to explore other things that people are wrong at. Right? So medicine is one.
You can see that Dana Ariely's career with judgment decision making, becoming the prominent scholar that he is, and all the books that he wrote, and his contribution to the field of behavioral economics, started with a very simple personal problem of it was just very painful after being burned 70% of his body. Question of, should you rip the bandages out when you have no skin, or should you take them out slowly? So sometimes we don't really think about, is something that we do in judgment decision making going to make a difference? But it really could, especially if you've got big people like Kahneman and Dana Ariely working on this. there are implications for policy, and then hospitals listen to this and they adapt to this. So you can see here is the paper that came out not too long ago, so 2 years after the pain, Daniel Kahneman. So both of them devoted a lot of time in order to try and study this. Dan Ariely, obviously, with personal implications, but very, very interesting studies that have changed our perspective and have affected medical decision making and policy. Okay, a few more questions about happiness. Let me just see. Yeah, so if you want, you can write this in a Mentimeter. If you want, you can just like talk to me. But let's say that I gave you 50 Hong Kong dollars to spend on yourself to make yourself happy. How do we relate the question of money and happiness? What would be a good way for us? I want you to be happy. I have 50 Hong Kong dollars to give you in order to make that happen, at least for the moment, in the moment. How would you say that you would spend this 50 Hong Kong dollars? What are some of the things that come to mind intuitively? I want to be happy now. I have 50 Hong Kong dollars. What should I do? What was that? Eat something like what? A cheesecake? Okay. That makes you happy in the moment? Yeah? Okay. 50 Hong Kong dollars, you can get like a decent cheesecake. Huh? A ferry to Chengchao. Okay, yeah. Okay. Nice, I like that. So maybe like a taxi to the beach or a ferry to like a nice island. Yeah, that's terrific. What other things? Yes, please. Sorry? Oh, save the money for future use. Is that going to make you happy in the moment though? In what way? Okay. So if somebody would give you 50 Hong Kong dollars now in order to make you happy, you would put this aside hoping that this would be an investment for some other time in the future. Let's take that approach. That is interesting. When would you cash it out? When would you know that it's time for you to be happy with this 50 Hong Kong dollars? Stock market, okay, that's like a risky stuff. You went all the risk all the way up. It could also drop after. Oh, I really like this debate. Okay, yeah, I have so many questions because, say for example, we take the 50 Hong Kong dollars and then you put this in the stock market and let's say you doubled it. Within 2 years, you doubled it. Now you have 100 Hong Kong dollars. And now you decided that you want to take it out. Do you think that with 100 Hong Kong dollars, accounting for inflation and all this, you will have double the happiness than 50 Hong Kong dollars? Yes, about double. So the way that you think about this investment is that double the money will give you double the happiness sometime in the future. Something like that. Interesting. Do you have any reactions to that? That's really interesting. Because you started with a statement, 50 Hong Kong dollars is not much. For some people, this is they can live off of this for a week, depending where you are in the world, right? In Hong Kong, perhaps not, but there are some people who might be able to use this for better means. So you can take a cheesecake, right, to help yourself have something nicer, sweeter, or you can give it to somebody who actually needs this 50 Hong Kong dollars in order to survive the day, right, in order to get something to eat. Who, for example, would you give this to? Older people? Okay. So, for example, now I give you 50 Hong Kong dollars. What do you do? Where would you find the older people that are looking for money, that are asking for money? Just go and give this to them. Okay. Okay. Whose happiness is going to be affected by this? So my aim was to give you 50 Hong Kong dollars so that you will feel happiness. She made very good use of this with a cheesecake. Yeah, tell me about that happiness. What do you feel? Why is giving this to the older person in Kennedy Town makes you feel more happy? Yeah, rationally I completely understand, but why would this affect your happiness? If we take this, which is also very interesting, I love the answers here. So if we take this, and we think about giving this to somebody who's not unfortunate. Let's say somebody else, I give you 50 Hong Kong dollars, and I ask you to give this to anybody else in the classroom. How would you compare these two experiences, giving this to the less fortunate or giving this to somebody in the classroom? Would both of them give you happiness, one over the other? much happier. And then giving this to somebody else compared to having a cheesecake on your own. You take a cheesecake. Why is that? What kind of comparisons are we making? Right. Meaning, what it gives us in our lives, and how is meaning related to the Daniel Kahneman experiencing, remembering? Definitely in the moment, cheesecake would be amazing, right? But in terms of our meaning, in terms of the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves, giving this to somebody else, giving this to the less fortunate, but also giving this to a classmate, perhaps a classmate that you know, a classmate that you don't know, tells us something about ourselves, a story that we like to hear, right? That we like to remember. So we need to remember all of these aspects of what it gives us. And sometimes happiness is very connected to meaning. That's a very good point. Yeah, I understand. I think, so when we think about this, giving this to somebody else actually has the potential of doubling happiness. Because first, it's you. You get this warm glow, this warm feeling inside that you've helped somebody else. And then the other person has that money, and then they feel happiness from that. Can you imagine what happens if that person gives this to a third person? 3 people, you've tripled this already. So you have the ability to multiply happiness, right? But what you're saying is that sometimes we need to put ourselves first because we are also important, right? Sometimes we need to know when to take a step back and say, people, I love them, I appreciate them, I want to help them, I want them to experience happiness, but I also need to make sure that I am happy. So giving all the exams and the stress and being a student is so hard. We deserve, every once in a while, we need a cheesecake, right? Yeah, good point. Good discussion. I like the points that you raised. Food, buy my mom some food. Okay, good. So helping others. Purchase something that can make us happy through biological mechanisms. Chocolate. Food that contains vitamin B6. What food contains vitamin B6? Not sure. Okay, but interesting. Thank you. Yeah, we can keep this. One more question that I want to ask you, because you complained that 50 Hong Kong dollars is not enough. Let's say that you won a big lottery, 100 million Hong Kong dollars. What would you do with that, and how do you think this would affect your happiness? Down payment on apartment in Hong Kong? This will immediately buy a house. This you don't want to put and save to double your happiness in 2 years? And donate a little. What is the donation part about? Okay, I like this. So you've got one typical investment like before, stock market you mentioned, and then you have the investment in a... Yeah, for sure. So I was going to say housing is an investment, but it feels like it's more than that. You would invest it in the stock market, but you chose a house. Why is the house so important for your happiness? What else? What other reactions? How do we spend the lottery? First thought was handing it over to my dad. Why your dad? What would happen if you wouldn't give this to your dad and you would keep it? What would happen to it? A lot of cheesecake. No? Oh, okay. Interesting. Because you don't trust yourself with 100. Okay, interesting. Okay, but this will make you happy. Give this to your dad. Okay, interesting. What do you think normally happens with lottery winners? Perhaps you've seen some articles or some news. They go bankrupt. So one thing that they do is that they spend it too fast. What other things happen to them when they win the lottery? They adapt to that lifestyle very fast. They start spending. What other things happen when you have a lot of wealth? Yeah, a lot of people start coming to you for money. So before you had meaningful relationships, you spent some time with your friends, hang out together, everything is cool because there's no money involved. Now you have money, they need to buy a house, right? They need to invest this, a lot of things that they don't have access to. So suddenly it becomes relationships turn into something materialistic, right? That involves money. And you're never really sure, are they spending time with me because they love me and they care about me? Or do they spend time with me because they want my money? That's why many of them start giving this away or start, feeling bad about themselves, or overspending, addictions, gambling. There's lots of problems with lotteries, which is why we tend to give this away to governments to handle, like the Jockey Club and, in various places, there are different kind of lotteries, because you need to be very careful with immediately moving from nothing or very little to having a lot. I need to be very careful with this. A Porsche 911. How much is a Porsche? I actually don't know. Like 1 million, 2 million? Okay. Did I have anything else here? No, I think that. Yeah. Okay. We'll keep this for the next one. And what's interesting about the notion of happiness is that people care so much about happiness that the best psychology course, the most popular psychology course ever to be in any university in the world, is by Laurie Santos at Yale University. So I'll let her talk about some of the insights. But the nice thing about this is that if you like studies about happiness and you want to know how to be happier, this one session that we're doing now can become a whole course, and it's free online. You can go. The certificate costs money, but you can actually see Laurie talk about this quite a bit. So I'll show you the first video, the 2 minutes. We'll take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about some of the insights from Laurie Santos. I really tried to remove the ads.
About the kinds of things that will really make us happy. We think it's more money, material possessions. My students think it's, perfect grades. The sad thing is that the research shows that a lot of those intuitions are just dead wrong. As a professor, I started to see on campus the mental health crisis that we hear so much about in the news, but I was really seeing it in the trenches. Students who were too depressed to function or having panic attacks because they were waiting for their grades or worried about their internships. Just realized that students needed some help to navigate the kind of mental health challenges that they were facing, and I thought the science of psychology really could provide them with some help. I've heard from mothers who've given this class to teens who are really struggling, who are feeling suicidal. And they feel like the tips that they've learned together as a family has really improved things and really helped people who are in really pretty serious mental health crisis. One of my favorite responses that we've received was from an elderly learner who wrote and said, I'm in my 80s, this is the first online class I've taken. Even in my 80s, these tips have been helping me. They're reminding me to spend more time with my grandkids and to spend more time being social. One of the most common critiques I get when I tell people I teach a class on the science of happiness is, wait, really? That's a science? When we think of happiness, we often think of something that's kind of ephemeral or even hokey or kind of, granola, hippy-dippy stuff. But what separates the platitudes from the scientific version of seeking happiness is the science part. Research shows the kinds of things we really can be doing. By that, we just mean.
So we'll take a break, we'll come back and we'll see some of the recommendations, and then I'll ask you to contemplate with me whether this sounds reasonable for you as something that increases your happiness or not. So we'll use a scientific approach to evaluate the science of Laurie Santos and happiness. So I think instead of showing you the very long video by Laurie Santos and asking you what you think, I'll just give you my take. We have some other more interesting things to cover. So I separated what Laurie did into 2 different sections and then added a little bit of my own. I want to tell you my understanding of the science of happiness is a little bit different. So I've tried to look at the credibility of some of the studies. I'll share this with you. And I separate this into 2. So I think what definitely has evidence in increasing your happiness is sleeping. Not too much sleeping, but at least a minimum amount of sleeping that the body requires. Work-life balance is a very important thing, which I think is neglected here in Hong Kong. It's something that I really try and tell students to do more, especially people, my collaborators, students that I work with. So less time working and more time for things that you enjoy. Self-nudging, we can use nudging in order to help ourselves. So doing habits, forming right habits for yourself, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Definitely friends, connecting to others, building meaningful relationships that make you feel good, distancing yourself from people who you do not feel good about. is very important, so connecting to the right others. And then if you have money, I think most of us would like to have more money, but it's not like we're lacking in it in a substantial way. If we have money, it would be wise to spend money to buy time and spend money more on experiences and less on material possessions. And I'll show you some of the evidence that we have on this and some of the replications that we ran here at HKU. Some of the things that Laurie Santos talked about, like talking to strangers, depends. It sounds like a very American thing. I'm not sure, like here on the MTR, this is gonna get you somewhere. Spending money on others depends what the right context is. Meditate. I think the jury's still out on that. Might work well for some, not so much for others. And then keeping a journal seems to be something that a lot of life coaches and people recommend, but the evidence that I've seen on this is a little bit problematic. I'll go back to Daniel Kahneman because Daniel Kahneman mentions one thing in his, very briefly in his talk, talking about the focusing illusion. And the thing is that just thinking about something shifts our ability or biases our ability to actually contemplate it objectively. And I'll give you one example that he talks about and how this relates to happiness.
Now you detail one of the many delightful parts of the book is the detail some of the patterns, the illusions and biases people have. And some of my favorites, maybe you could describe, well, you can describe your own favorites, though I would nominate the focusing illusion and the planning effect, I believe it's called.
Planning fallacy.
The planning fallacy. Maybe you could describe some of your favorite common biases there.
I like the focusing illusion a lot. It's a very simple idea. You know, you think of, say, moving to California, or how happy people are in California. And by and large, people greatly exaggerate how happy Californians are. And the reason is that when you think of California, you're drawing a contrast, and the contrast, one of the obvious contrasts is going to be climate, and they have a more desirable climate. And you think, and at that time, that's the one thing you're thinking about. So if they have a better climate, you immediately jump to the conclusion, this is the way system one works. You jump to the conclusion that they must be happier. In fact, climate is not all that important in happiness. But now it turns out this is generally true. Whatever you think about in your life, you're going to exaggerate its importance. And there's nothing you can do about it. You attend to it, and you exaggerate its importance.
So this is very important, focusing illusions, because once you ask a question of how you compare your happiness to people who are in better climate or better at something else, you immediately focus on that attribute and you forget all the other attributes. Could be that attribute is not even that important. So what kind of comparisons do we do aside from weather in the US, comparing yourself to California and Florida? What kind of comparisons do we make about happiness? We compare ourselves to the rich. If we had money, if only we had the house at the peak, then we would be happy. Then things would be happy. But then that neglects a lot of other things to do with that in comparisons in our lives. Could be that other things will make us happier than that. Maybe that we are overemphasizing this just because of that contrast. What other focusing illusions do we typically have about happiness? A beautiful girlfriend, yeah, a beautiful partner. Yeah, so I see another person with a beautiful partner, and I'm like, if only I had a beautiful partner, then I would be so much happier. But then perhaps there's other attributes about a partner, or other attributes have nothing to do with a partner that would make me much happier in my life. Perhaps not having a partner would make me happier in my life. There's so many other options over there. But by contrasting, this is my partner, this is his or her partner, and then there's a contrast. Very good example of focusing illusion. Somebody else wanted to say? You wanted to say something? Yeah. Career, for sure, a lot. My income, you know, people talk about the salaries, even in the same office. It's like, what kind of offer you got and what kind of offer I got. It could be that I'm very happy in my job. You know, every day I come happy in the morning and then I sit for lunch and then I hear the other person's salary and I'm like, what? They make so much, and everything is destroyed about my perception of job. Why is that? Because I focused on this. It's not even important because I really enjoyed my job before that. And like Daniel Kahneman is saying, you can see people are laughing around him. He doesn't like to get this kind of reaction because he's a very scientific mindset. But you can't ignore it. It's with you. What the mind does is just remarkable. And it really affects your ability to be happy. So this is an example from the paper that he published on the focusing illusion about happiness, where he did large samples of students in the Midwest and in Southern California. And he asked them how happy they are, what is it that they care about in their happiness, and then he asked them to compare, to think about the others. Self-reported overall life satisfaction was the same in both regions. So actually, Californians and Midwest people are about the same. And then you ask people, it's like, what is the most important thing for you in terms of your happiness? And people say job prospects, academic opportunity, financial situation, personal safety, social life, outdoor activities, natural beauty, cultural opportunity. Where is the contrast about the weather? Down here at the end. This is how much winter happens. It wasn't convincing for me because I kept comparing the Midwest to Hong Kong. I had to find my way back to a warmer climate. But at the end, definitely there's lots of other things that matter to me, which I neglected because the contrast was so strong that I couldn't think of anything else. So it's very interesting to try and do these kinds of comparisons and then try to map this out so you can have an overall understanding of where you are and how you're affected by these kinds of things. And we talked about hedonic adaptation. It could be, if I gave it another year or two, I would have social connections and I would have the financial stability and I would have all these other things make my life in the Midwest, and then I wouldn't even care about the winter. I would find other ways to enjoy my life. How about the rich? Comparing ourselves to the rich. Another paper by Daniel Kahneman about happiness and the rich. So focusing illusion about comparing ourselves to people in high income. So we tend to think, if only we had a little bit more money, we would be so much happier. So he shows this in all kinds of different comparisons along the way. It's very interesting to go into this if we had a bit more time. But at the end, the way that we see the connection when we look at this is that basically from lower class to middle class, there is a large incline because we do have basic needs that we need attending to. We need food, we need shelter, we need security in our life. So here is a large increase. But starting from middle class, which is most of the Hong Kong population is middle class and above, you can see the increase is very, very slight. So it's almost negligible compared to many other things. So if you ask rich people in Hong Kong and you ask middle class people in Hong Kong, in terms of happiness, they're about the same. Even people who shifted their wealth and grew in wealth, happiness did not grow linearly with that, but rather a very mild increase in that. I was very surprised about this paper that came out recently in PNAS, trying to question what Daniel Kahneman was saying experienced well-being rises with income even above $75,000 per year. And people are like, oh, so everything that Daniel Kahneman is saying is wrong. You can actually see, look at this huge increase, both from lower class to middle class and middle class to upper class. And immediately when a paper like this comes that questions an entire literature, people want to look into this. And they use huge samples, so over 1,700,000 experience sampling from 33,000 people. So I'm like, I need to rewrite my lectures. But then what's interesting about this is that immediately, as this happened last year, immediately people were looking at this. So I just like copy pasted some of the tweets. And it looks like they made a very specific error, or they didn't account for something. And when you actually take their data and plot it out the right way, looking at the right scale, it does seem like it supports what Daniel Kahneman was saying. So they published a paper with the wrong conclusions, but their data actually shows support for this very slight increase in terms of the income, very slight increase in happiness. So sometimes it's interesting to see how the academic literature happens. You have something, and then somebody questions that, and then because it's completely different to everything else that we knew, people actually go back and look at this, and then they come into the conclusion that supports the previous literature. So interesting development in the literature. I wanted just to share with you a little bit about some of the things that are happening in the debate, and it's still ongoing. People are still questioning some of this research, but generally it seems like the Kahneman findings are holding quite well. How effective is more money? So you would say perhaps if you compare middle class to upper class, perhaps you don't see much differences. Let's say that there's a pandemic and we randomly give people $2,000 or $500 or nothing. Does this make them happier? And it seems like there is a slight increase. There's a little bit of a boost, but then at the end, everything goes back to about the same level. So it's an interesting randomized controlled trial of trying to help people, individuals in the US during the pandemic, to give them some support. But it seems like at least with these kinds of sums, giving people that kind of money doesn't increase happiness for very long. It addresses very specific current needs. A lot of other papers, Kahneman is almost in all of these, but all of these slides come from Ashley Williams that I will talk about because she came up with a book last year, which I really appreciate, and I'll give you some of her insight, is that increasingly in the modern world, and I kind of feel sorry for you that you enter this world because this is the world that we created for you, the previous generation, is that there's a lot of pressure for you to be busy, to produce, to succeed, to achieve, to have a lot of amazing things like a lot of friends and a lot of social media presence and a lot of this, a lot of that. Everything is about comparison. So even back in the 2000s, this already seemed like a trend. Like every generation has more and more pressure, but nowadays it's becoming almost insane. And the question is, for us, is that when we have money and time, which one of these two is more important? And it seems like some of this pressure to be successful is measured by most people about how much money they're making. There's a lot of emphasis in our society, especially in Hong Kong, about how much money people are making. But we really need to rethink this. So Ashley Williams, her main message based on the, I think, very solid literature, is that to promote happiness, we should spend money to change the way that we spend our time. If we think about this, the one resource that we really lack, the one resource that really matters the most, is our time. We're not going to get our time. There's no way for us to extend our time. There is a certain amount of time that we'll spend in this world, depending, of course, on your religion. But given what it is that we know, we have a limited time. And if we spend that time getting money that we don't know if leads to happiness, then we might be wasting that. So Ashley here claims that we are the biggest problem that we have is time poverty, not financial poverty, not that we don't have enough money, is that we don't have enough time. And we need to reshift, retell the story of what's lacking in our lives. And once we understand that the one thing that we don't have is time, then everything changes about the way that we build our schedule, the way that we build relationships. So I'll let Ashley tell you a little bit about that. Okay.
I have the power to make you all less time poor right now. It's true. I could leave the stage and give you 4.75 minutes back. But I'm not going to do that. I don't trust you. You would squander that free time. Perhaps by passively scrolling on your phone until the next talk starts, or if you're anything like me, answering just one more work email. It isn't our fault that we fail to prioritize time or that we lose moments of free time. Our brains get in the way. Human beings are pretty much allergic to leisure. Researchers call this phenomenon idleness aversion. I mean, let's be real. When's the last time someone asked you what your plans were for today and you cheerily replied, nothing? We also think we're going to have more time in the future than we do in the present. I like to call this bias the yes, damn effect, and it works in life a little bit something like this. Monday. Hey Ash, can you help me move Saturday? No problem. Tuesday. Hey Ash, want to go to dinner on Saturday? Sounds great. Wednesday. Professor Willens, I have a paper due Monday and I would really appreciate your help on Saturday. Of course. Yes, 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 Saturday. Damn. Oh, what was I thinking? When the future becomes the present, we often wish we could take back the things we said yes to. It is clear, our societies and our minds are conspiring against us when it comes to time. We are taught that money is our most valuable resource. Our free time becomes time confetti thanks to our constant connection to our cell phones. And we say yes way too often, in part because we think we're going to have more time in the future than we do in the present. But luckily for us, just like people who are physically fit, the time-rich among us make small, simple decisions in their everyday lives that allow them to have more and better time. The time-rich among us prioritize time over money. No matter how much money they make, they're willing to give up some of their money in order to have more and better time. They're also likely to take all of their paid vacations. Now, this seems obvious, but many of us don't do it. If your boss were to put a giant stack of money on the table in front of you, you wouldn't walk away from it. But by failing to take all of your paid vacation, that's essentially what you're doing. You're walking away from a gift of time. They also spend more time savoring their daily experiences. My collaborator and I have data showing that the French spend more time eating and are less stressed and happier as a result. In contrast, Americans spend more time choosing their food than actually enjoying it. To be clear, scrolling Grubhub for hours is not a path to greater time affluence or happiness. They also spend time engaged each day in activities that we know are good for happiness, socializing with friends and family, volunteering, and exercising, even if just for a few minutes. As it turns out, giving away our time for free by volunteering is one of the best ways to feel like we have more of it. Maybe they have more time for these activities because they're also willing to pay to outsource their most disliked tasks to others. My data suggests that simply spending as little as $40 to outsource our most dreaded tasks to others can really pay off in terms of happiness and stress. Lastly, the time-rich among us keep time-affluent to-do lists. Each day, we are rewarded with small moments of free time, like during our morning commute or while standing in line at our local supermarket. The time-rich among us don't squander this free time. They capitalize on it. They keep lists with activities that they can complete in these found moments, like texting their friend, calling their mom, or reading an ebook. So the next time you feel compelled to take that "what celebrity do I look like" quiz on the internet, try texting your best friend instead. It can be hard to prioritize time, in part because unless we are paid by the hour, it isn't always easy to measure what the value of our time is worth. A $10,000 raise is easy to understand. However, the value of an additional 30 minutes of free time isn't quite so simple. But we can make time-related choices easier for ourselves. I work at a business school, so the only way I can get my MBAs to care about happiness is if I put it in a currency that they care about and understand: money. But what I use in these calculations isn't money per se, but rather the income equivalent of happiness, or what I like to call happiness dollars. I define happiness dollars as the income equivalent of the happiness that you'd experience from making a time-related choice. Now, of course, the numbers that I get in these calculations will depend on how much money you make. And as it turns out, people who make less money actually benefit more from making time-related decisions.
It's really an interesting take on this, and because she's in the business school, she does that even better. But I think that's a revolutionary approach that's only happened in the last 2 decades for people to understand that you need to emphasize time over money and that you need to take your investments in money and put that into gaining more time. So I've had lots of discussions in my family. My hour, my time actually is worth a lot more than hiring somebody to clean the apartment for me or outsourcing all sorts of things that I don't like to do. You want to say something? Yeah. It's a very good point. I think it's first of all a philosophical debate, and then a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking how we should prioritize happiness. But I think we increasingly understand that happiness is important. It's part of flourishing. And once the entire world is increasingly getting to a point where we all have basic needs met, how do we get to a point where people also feel a sense of well-being, satisfaction, which are certain aspects of being happy? So we need to break apart what is happiness, what aspects of that do we care about. But definitely we need to include this in our equation, and many places don't. Sometimes we feel like we need to sacrifice our own happiness for our parents, for our society, for other things. But increasingly, there's more and more cultures that try and emphasize happiness when looking at the equation. It's not only that aspect, but happiness should definitely be there. How much you want to do that depends on all sorts of other things. But at least you need to know that if you've emphasized happiness, how would you gain that? How would you help others to be better at that? But very good point. How do we really know that happiness is important? We should have more debates on this. So Ashley, over here with Elizabeth Dunn and other people that we've talked about before, Michael Norton, 2017, is that it really buying time, so spending money in order to buy time, outsourcing the things that you don't like, promotes happiness. And they've done a bunch of surveys and experiments on this, and some data from the United States, Canada, Denmark, the Netherlands. Definitely weird countries, Western, rich, educated, industrialized, and all of that. But I've seen some of the replication work that has been done in order to show that this is cross-cultural, and I'll come to that at the end if we'll have time. Here's some of the data that she has from some samples. So 99% of the people want to spend money on buying time, but only 17% of them actually do this because of our emphasis on money. Like, we need to save, we need to put this, we shouldn't spend this on something like time because we feel like we have a lot of time and don't have enough of money. If you ask millionaires, it seems like millionaires know how to do this more because they're less under pressure, but even millionaires, about half of them don't do that. So it's not so much, or let's say not only about the amount of money that you have, but also about general pressure that you have from society. It's actually the same group, Ashley here with Paul Smith, Michael Norton, and Rene Beckers, actually went and compared how millionaires live their life compared to how regular people. It's very difficult to approach millionaires to fill out your questionnaire. So for them to be able to do this is an amazing achievement. And it seems like millionaires use their time in some critical ways differently. It seems like millionaires spend more of their time engaged in active leisure, like exercising, volunteering, rather than passive leisure, like watching TV and relaxing, that it seems like many of us default to. And then also, they engage in tasks at work which they had more control over. And perhaps there's some things that not everything that the millionaires do we need to learn from, but at least with these two things, it seems like the affluent are making better decisions when it comes to time, because they have the basics met. At least for middle class and above, we can start to imitate some of the decisions done by millionaires. This is actually from the book Time Smart, and I invite you to put yourself somewhere here. So thinking about how much spare time do you have from -5 to 5, 0 is the middle, and then how much spare money available you have, and then from very little to a lot, and then see where you are in this graph. If you have your basic needs met, and I think many of us do, above neutral, then above here, then you don't need to emphasize money as much because you have your needs met. But I think most of us, when it comes to time-related stuff, put ourselves on the left rather than on the right. And then we have two categories. So if we have money but we don't have time, then we can substitute these two. And these are the typical time-poor people that can make the switch. And I try as much as I can to implement that switch. And then there's people who don't have time and don't have money, and these are extremely poor because they can't substitute their money for time. She has a lot of common time traps, so I recommend the book. What's nice about it is that at the end it gives you tasks. So it allows you to work on how you can improve your time management. So for example, remove the constant connection to technology. Definitely affects your sleep, affects all kinds of things, skills. Going through the YouTube short or whatever, Instagram, scrolling endlessly and just wasting your time where you can do other more meaningful things with others. Obsession about work and making money, which I can see with a lot of my students in Hong Kong for reasons that I don't understand. And this is one thing that at least I can see big cultural differences compared to before that I was in the Netherlands. So the Netherlands definitely emphasized a lot more of the social connections, and work-life balance is really important. Busyness as a status symbol. A lot of students report in their internships that they just need to stay 5 minutes longer than the boss to appear as if they're working very, very hard, even though they have nothing to do and they finish their work long before that. How to build time affluence. So find time. So there's all sorts of techniques, exercises that she gives you, how you can find more time. So if you think you're very time poor, it could be that you actually don't know your ability to find time, and she will help you with all kinds of tasks. Sometimes you can fund time, and sometimes you can reframe time. So for example, commute time, she says, you feel like you're just staying on the MTR, holding something and waiting for half an hour until you get to the university. But I listen to a podcast, I listen to audiobooks during my commute. Sometimes you can text your friends and make some connections and make some calls. You can reframe time from commute time to talking to my mom, time talking to my friends, time listening to my favorite audiobooks or podcasts. So I really like these exercises. It's very nice at the end of each chapter how you can regain your talk. And the first time that I gave this talk about happiness, students were asking me, it's great that you're teaching this, but are you actually practicing this, exercising some of these? And I really try. So I think I showed already some of you that I do a lot of hikes in Hong Kong. During the pandemic, I had a rule that if I can't travel abroad, at least twice a week, I will wake up very early in the morning and do a hike. And it's also nice to share this with others because then others can, want to come and visit us in Hong Kong. So some people react to this as like, when is the next conference in Hong Kong? I want to come and visit. So I think by now I have like 101 different videos, places in Hong Kong with a Google map that you can go and press on this link and see all the places that I visited. It doesn't matter where you are. So I've lived in many places in the world. There's always something interesting that you can do in nature, attractions, museums, especially a place like Hong Kong. There's just so much to see and do. So I make this a priority, even when I'm very stressed, even when there's a lot of work. It's very important for you to take the taxi 10 minutes away to Repulse Bay or the ferry to Cheung Chau in order to disengage from things, clear your mind, think about things in a different way. Another recommendation, I love this paper. It's amazing. Came out in Nature. I did not expect this. Saying how wonderful it is to go for experiences like going to Burning Man. So they went and interviewed people before, during, and after Burning Man, and then showing that immediately and 6 months following events like Burning Man, transformative experiences persisted and predicted things like generosity, moral expansion, and otherwise. So I don't know if you're familiar with Burning Man, but almost every place in the world has something a little bit like that. There's Midburn in Israel. In Hong Kong, not exactly like this, but Glockenflap is happening soon. So there's more festivals coming up, music festivals, lots of bands. So you can have transformative experiences in various places in the world. And sometimes you say, no, but I'm too busy. Like I'm studying. There's something else that I'm doing. But these kinds of 2-3 days, 1 week to get away from things, to connect to others, to do something that's different, can get you to experience happiness not just for that week, but for a much longer duration. So something that I recommend, and it's a cool paper because they measure so many things. So showing scientific evidence for that in all sorts of different ways. How about prosociality? A little bit like giving your money away to Kennedy Town elderly. Prosociality, spending money on others. Once again, Elizabeth Dunn, Michael Norton. I tried to look at the evidence for this. So this is a science paper from 2008. And I really wanted this to work. However, already when I looked at this, I was also talking to the other class, Advanced Social Psychology. I already noticed some issues. For example, over here, they identified a bug in the statistical package SPSS that caused things to go from not highly, but a little significant to not significant. So already this science paper in 2008, the evidence is not as strong as before. But what's nice about this is that they conducted a pre-registered registered report replication of this, exactly the same group, many years later, so 2020. So this is from 2 years ago, and it seems like some things work and some things don't work. So you need to look at what exactly is happening. But it seems like under some conditions, giving money to others, depending on whether these are people who are in need or people who are around you, under some circumstances, it does seem like spending that money on others promotes happiness. Here they did this with giving Starbucks vouchers, asking you to buy something for yourself in Starbucks, or buying something for a friend or a stranger, and then comparing these two. So even when you have a science paper from 2008, you want to go to the most recent evidence and see whether that holds, preferably with large samples, so pretty big samples over here, 2,000 adults, and from 2020 with a register report. So always check the evidence, even if it comes from science. Also very good to look at the meta-analysis about the relationship between being prosocial and well-being. And it does seem like there's a correlation. It's not a super large correlation, but 0.13 is considered to be a weak to medium effect in social psychology. So definitely there seems to be a correlational relationship between being prosocial and well-being. Yeah, getting to the cross-cultural differences. It does seem like there's differences between the reported life satisfaction in various countries around the world, depending on, on one scale we have GDP per capita, and we have self-reported life satisfaction. Not surprising, I think, that lower income has less of a life satisfaction, but we can try and break this apart in order to see how these things evolve. And then there's some really surprising things at the end. So for example, Uzbekistan, Colombia, Mexico, because of happiness, it seems like there's all sorts of things that deviate from our expectations. Also, it seems like some of the things that we thought only hold for weird cultures, only in the West, when we conducted around 166 nations with 1.7 million respondents. These things that I told you about, hedonic adaptation for marriage, employment, prosociality, life meaning, also tend to happen. And then the impact of having or not having some of those. So what is the difference between having and not having marriage? Not that big. And definitely not according, so it depends, of course, on the different cultures. It seems to be the largest one, so these are the significant one you can see with the blue, has to do more with employment and things like life meaning. So these are the things that we should emphasize when we look at all kinds of predictors. Finally, the one thing that we replicated last year, now it's ongoing in a review. So now I can tell you that this works and replicates well, is that if you spend things on experiences rather than materialistic possessions, then that will tend to increase your happiness more, both when you do this in the moment and recall in your life. So this classic paper is a lot of citations, 2012, compared the way that people think about material possessions and experiences, and people tend to think of their experiential purchases as more connected to the self 10 possessions. They drew their experiential processes physically closer to the self in a drawing task. They were more likely to mention experiences were telling their life story, so not so much, my Porsche 911, but more of like I went to Burning Man, that kind of thing. The way that they described their experiential possessions, thought that this represents them a lot more. There's more overlap with their sense of who they are, and it just generally gives greater insight. So when you sit with somebody for a discussion, rather than, this is my iPhone, look at how wonderful my camera is, more about this is what I experienced, this is my life, this is how I spent my money in order to gain another experience. So wonderful, and we just replicated this. Very nice signal. Some things we even had larger effects than in the original, but it doesn't get more successful of a replication than this. So some of the things that we do in order to make sure that happiness really is well represented and accurate in the literature seems to hold about many of the findings that we talked about today. So this is very, very briefly about the link between social psychology, judgment, decision making, and something like happiness. I wanted to give you a sense that we can use our scientist hat in order to study our pain, study how we suffer, how to reduce pain if we get into a sickness like Kahneman Ariely, we burn, how to make sure that our patients in the hospitals and when we get ill that we don't suffer as much, but also on how to increase happiness. And sometimes with some counterintuitive findings that do seem to hold. So emphasizing time, spending time with others, putting things into experiences rather than materialistic things. Just generally framing things in the right way in order to make sure that we make the most of our lives and our connections to others. If you want more of that, there's 2 good courses, one by Laurie Santos about happiness, and there's a lot of room for you to come and contribute. So even if the great Daniel Kahneman can have with the Nobel Prize a lot of talks about happiness, and says that he's only beginning to explore the field, then if you're interested in this and you think that judgment decision making or social psychology is interesting for you, you can go and study this. In graduate school, in industry, a lot of people care about happiness and want to be more happy in their life. See you next week.